I did want to talk to you today about my new book, God of Liberty, and give you a little snapshot of the role that I see religion playing in the American Revolution. And I want to open with a story about a chaplain named David Avery. The evangelical chaplain David Avery of Franklin, Connecticut, saw his first action of the Revolutionary War at the Battle of Bunker Hill. That June in 1775, Minutemen from New England seized Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill in Charlestown, Massachusetts, just to the north of British-occupied Boston. Under the cover of darkness, the colonial troops hastily built fortifications atop Breed's Hill that would allow them to bombard the British army across the river. The sight of the fort so provoked the British that they decided to assault the insolent militiamen and drive them from the Charlestown Heights. The British Navy barraged Charlestown, setting the small town's wooden buildings ablaze, while 2,300 British infantrymen crossed the narrow Charles River to attack the 1,500 colonists occupying the hill. As the redcoats began to ascend Breed's Hill, Avery stood on nearby Bunker Hill and raised his arms towards heaven, praying for God to bless the American forces. For a time, his prayers seemed to work. The first American volleys unleashed terrible destruction on the British, who retreated. They regrouped and assaulted the hill once more, only to be repulsed by a volley that to one of the surviving British soldiers sounded like a, quote, uninterrupted peal of thunder. As the British surged forward for a third assault, the American commander reportedly shouted for the Americans not to fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The militiamen began shooting only at close range, but they had begun to run out of ammunition. Some drew back from the charging British, while others tried firing nails or pieces of scrap metal from their guns or bludgeoning the redcoats with their muskets. But in hand-to-hand combat, the militiamen were overwhelmed by the British troops and their bayonets, and the Americans called for a general retreat. The colonial troops took severe losses in the battle, but the British losses were even greater. With over 1,000 casualties, it was the bloodiest clash for the redcoats during the war. Avery found the battle to be truly horrific. Quote, "To us infantile Americans, unused to the thunder and carnage of battle, the flames of Charlestown before our eyes, the incessant play of cannon from their shipping, all heightened the majestic terrors of the field, exhibiting a scene most awful and tremendous." Yet Avery came to see the British Army's costly victory at Bunker Hill as a sign of divine favor for the Patriots. God, Avery said, quote, "was our rock and fortress. He covered our heads with a helmet of salvation." For this evangelical chaplain, it was God who had broken up the formidable British Army, who had covered the Americans' retreat, and who had turned what should have been a rout of the Patriots into a brave defense by the Americans. Through counseling, preaching, and praying, Avery helped troops understand that God remained with them, even in defeat. As a young man, Avery had experienced salvation under the ministry of the celebrated evangelical preacher George Whitefield. He had gone on to be tutored by the pastor and founder of Dartmouth College, Eleazar Wheelock, and had graduated from Yale and served for a time as a missionary to the Oneida Indians. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, Avery had himself become a luminary among evangelicals, preaching in the emotional style of Whitefield while embracing the Calvinist theology of Jonathan Edwards, the brilliant pastor and theologian of Northampton, Massachusetts. The news of the opening of the war at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts in April 1775 compelled Avery to leave his congregation in Vermont to serve the patriot cause. In the Army, Avery spent most of his days praying with sick and dying soldiers who were facing the threat of mortal disease more often than enemy fire. He occasionally served on reconnaissance and sentry duty, too. He was one of more than 100 chaplains in the Continental Army, where faith played a vital role. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, Avery fled with General George Washington through New York and New Jersey during the bleak fall of 1776. Washington had evacuated New York City, just barely escaping capture by the British that August. Following defeats at White Plains and Fort Washington in New York, Washington's army retreated into New Jersey and Pennsylvania. It was the darkest time of the war, and many began to wonder whether Washington had what it took to lead the Americans to victory. And some Americans might have wondered whether God did indeed see the justice of their cause. On Christmas night of 1776, Avery crossed the Delaware River with Washington and witnessed the surprise attack on the Hessians, mercenaries hired by the British Army, at Trenton, New Jersey. The unexpected victory at Trenton was Washington's great moment of redemption. Although Americans would later remember the terrible weather on the night of the crossing before the attack, Avery and other American soldiers struggled much more with the conditions of the return trip back across the Delaware River on December 26th. The second crossing was so rough that Avery thought he might die. Quote, "We were greatly distressed with a very cold storm of rain, hail, and snow, which blew with great violence. I was extremely chilled and came near perishing before I could get to a fire." Avery also saw Washington's critical victory at Trenton as orchestrated by God. Adverse weather and fierce British troops could not ultimately stop what Avery saw as a holy struggle for freedom. Avery was present too when British General John Burgoyne surrendered his great army to the Americans at Saratoga, New York in October 1777. Burgoyne had hoped to invade upstate New York and cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, a move that Avery and others feared would allow the British to unleash French Catholic and Native American hordes from the north to overrun the colonists. The French Catholics of Canada remained an ominous presence to many Protestant Americans throughout the war, even though in 1778 France would ally with the Americans and enter the war against Britain. Burgoyne's humiliating defeat led Avery to call for, quote, "the highest thanks of all Americans to the God of armies." Such victories buttressed the beliefs held by Avery and legions of Americans of all denominations that the Revolutionary War was not simply about unfair taxes and colonial politics. The conflict summoned Americans to support God's sacred cause of liberty. It was not only traditional evangelical believers who saw religious meaning in the war and the founding of the American nation. Let's fast forward for a minute, beyond the war and beyond the framing of the Constitution, to the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson in that election defeated the sitting president, John Adams, in what Jefferson styled the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson's election was the final event of the Revolutionary era and the first peaceful transfer from one party to another under the new Constitution. And on New Year's Day, 1802, the Baptist evangelist John Leland delivered a prodigious gift to the new president, a 1,235-pound block of cheese. They called it the Mammoth Cheese. And it came from Leland's farming community of Cheshire, Massachusetts, which seems to have voted unanimously for Jefferson in the 1800 presidential election. And the cheese's red crust was adorned with the motto, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." 2 days later, on Sunday, January 3rd, Leland delivered an effusive sermon before a joint session of Congress and the president. A hostile Federalist congressman in attendance, writing in his journal, called Leland a cheesemonger and a, quote, "poor, ignorant, illiterate, clownish preacher."